Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Anthony Peake. I was going to say Consciousness Hour, but well, it is actually Consciousness Hour, so I have actually got it. I'm so confused already. I've been looking forward to this discussion today for a long time, and myself and my guest John Einarson have just been talking now for the last 15 minutes, and I wish we'd recorded some of the things because we have such similar taste in music. But already I'm telling you, some of the anecdotes and experiences are just going to really, hopefully, really amuse you. Now, what's the background to this? Well, many years ago, I think it was late 1969. Myself and my friends, a couple of my friends, we managed to bunk in to see an X movie, which was playing in our local cinema in Birkenhead on Merseyside. And the movie was Easy Rider. And it was kind of a really trendy, we'd heard about how trendy this all was. And of course, we all wanted to go around on chopper bikes and everything else. And funnily enough, a few years ago, I did manage to go to the bridge, which filmed the sequence of the bridge in that particular movie in Arizona. So it was really wonderful. I recognized the bridge as we went past it. I thought, I know that bridge. But anyway, the movie was really good and I really enjoyed it and everything else. But there was one particular track that really stunned me. And it was a song called I Wasn't Born to Follow by an American band called The Byrds. Now, I'd heard of The Byrds and I knew of them, but, you know, I was only, 14 at the time, 15. So it didn't particularly register with me that much, but that song really stunned me. So I started checking up on The Byrds and I found that here was this musical style that kind of came almost from the kind of Mersey beat jangly guitars of the Beatles and the Searchers. But they'd taken it to another level. And then I checked out some more of the Byrds albums and I came across tracks like 8 Miles High. Was it 8 Miles High? It was 8 Miles High, it was 8. Yes. From their double album Untitled. And I suddenly found there was this genre of music I really identified with. And that genre of music became known as country rock. But it's a wonderful amalgam of so many different styles of music. And a few months ago, I came across a book called Desperados, written by John Einarson, who is a Canadian journalist come music writer living in Winnipeg in Canada. And his book was wonderful. And it gave me so many stories. And suddenly I was spinning off, checking out bands I hadn't realized existed. So suddenly I've enhanced my musical collection massively just by John's wonderful book. And I started reading his other books and I realized that we have so much in common in terms of musical taste. And I've just discovered after our quick discussion now, even more so. So already, folks, we've already agreed that John will be coming back for a 2-hour session where we're going to get more into this, the whole thing of our interest in musical taste. But without further ado, John, welcome to Anthony Peake's Consciousness Hour.
Thank you, Tony. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. Now, some of the things we were just been talking about before, I really just want to zoom in on because they're such wonderful pearls. I was explaining to John that I remember Christmas 1970 buying the Led Zeppelin album, Led Zeppelin 3, when it first came out, and listening to, particularly when you listen to that album, the first track on it is Immigrant Song. And it's the one that really takes you by the lapels and you go, wow, this is extraordinary. And a year later, I was explaining to John, I managed to see Led Zeppelin in Liverpool at Mountford Hall, and I was in the front row. And in fact, what happened was they were preparing to do Stairway to Heaven, because it was obviously one of the tracks they were working on at the time. And I remember grabbing Robert Plant's foot. I was that close, and he pulled himself back. And I thought, this is a really great anecdote. And I thought, there's no way that John could beat that, but John can. Bow, come in then.
Well, yeah, in 1970, I was 17 years old in August of 70, and there was a big music event called Man Pop, and Led Zeppelin were the headliners, along with Iron Butterfly. And my band, Euphoria, was the opening act on the show. We opened the show for Iron Butterfly and Led Zeppelin. And when we do the 2-hour show, I'll bring the picture of me from there, 17 years old, hair down to here. And I remember turning my amp on, they announced the name of the band, and turning around, and there's 14,000 people. And I go, and that's the moment that they snapped the picture of me with my Telecaster, looking stunned at the time. But you touched Robert Plant, and that's pretty cool. My connection to him again comes a little later on. I'd written a book on Gene Clark called Mr. Tambourine Man: The Life and Legacy of the Byrds Gene Clark, and he was a huge Gene Clark fan. And in fact, on the album he did with Alison Krauss, they did 2 Gene Clark songs.
They did indeed, but was it Burning Sand?
Raising Sand.
Raising Sand, that's right, yeah.
And he was also a huge Arthur Lee fan. And in fact, when Arthur was sick, Arthur Lee of Love, when Arthur was sick with leukemia, Robert Plant on his own dime flew over to America along with Ian Hunter, and they did a fundraising show in New York for Arthur. So I got an email from Robert's management person and saying Robert would like copies of your books. So I signed them to Robert Plant and sent them off. I haven't heard if he ever read them or not, but I never touched his foot. So you got me beat on that one.
I'm sure he wasn't terribly happy about it at the time. But I had actually we'd been in the queue all night to get the tickets. So it was you're just in awe. And of course, the noise level and the sound was extraordinary. But it was.
But I was going to mention about, because you mentioned sorry to cut in about Immigrant Song. They weren't, because it rained. The thing got kind of moved indoors on a makeshift stage and all that. But they had a clause in the contract that said if it rains, because it's an outdoor event, we don't have to play and we still get paid. But there was a local singer named Diane Hetherington who went and banged on their hotel room door where they were all congregating with Peter Grant, and she gave them hell. She said, you guys owe it to the people. There's 10,000 people in the rain soaked. And so they came out and played. I mean, they set up a makeshift PA system using the Guess Who's Garnet amplifiers as speakers, and they started at 2 o'clock and played, but what 2 in the morning. But what was amazing was they opened with Immigrant Song that none of us had heard before. And it was mind blowing. They'd just written it in June when they were played in Iceland. And at that point, I don't even think they'd recorded it yet. But they were opening their shows that summer with Immigrant Song. And it will always be in my mind hearing that song and seeing them on this.
So that's why the
stage.
That's why the imagery, I've come from the land of the ice and snow. So that's the Midnight Sun. And so that's clearly, and I was wondering, was that the famous tour that Led Zeppelin got involved in, the Vancouver incident with the prostitutes in the hotel with the shark or something?
I don't know that one. As far as I know, there were no prostitutes at the International Inn in Winnipeg. But I had a few years ago, I was invited to I do the speeches about history of Winnipeg music and PowerPoints and all that sort of thing. I'm kind of a song and dance man. And it was for the Icelandic consulate and the Icelandic ambassador who was come from Iceland to come to Winnipeg. There's lots of Icelanders in Winnipeg. I'm Icelandic. And so I explained the history behind that song, Immigrant Song. And then on acoustic guitar, I slowed it down and I sang and played it, so people could actually hear the words to it, whereas it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out what Robert's singing in it. I come from the land of the ice and snow, all that sort of thing. So you're
quite right. I mean, the lyrics are quite wonderful, that song, and it would be very interesting to hear a slowed down version of it, because I'm sure everybody just gets into the vibe of it without realizing what he's saying.
Yeah.
And that was always the thing about Zeppelin, wasn't it? I mean, lyrically, they were always very interesting, weird songs.
Well, once they got to the third album and then into the fourth album, the first 2 albums, the lyrics are so, pardon my language, cock rock kind of music.
Yeah, the Lemon Song. The Lemon Song. I mean, how did they get away with that one? I just don't know, really. But obviously there was obviously an image there. But going back then and rolling backwards, so what got you into country rock specifically? Because you started more as a hard rocker. Obviously, with your interest in bands like Bachman Turner Overdrive and the Guess Who, clearly much heavier, and of course Iron Butterfly and Inagada Davida. And what a weird album that was. Wasn't the story that it was the lead singer couldn't say in the Garden of Eden or something?
Yes, that's right. Well, you sort of say, kind of mumbling it stoned, I guess. And they came on, no one knew if Zeppelin was going to follow them or not at that point. But they did the whole song, 25 minutes with the interminable drum solo in it. My roots in music go back to 1965, and seeing the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of '64. I mean, I wanted a guitar. And so the minute my parents put a guitar in my hand, just after Christmas of '65, just changed my life forever. And the music that caught me, first of all, was actually blues. The Paul Butterfield Blues Band, the Blues Project, got me into tracing Chicago blues and buying albums by B.B. King and Buddy Guy and Otis Rush and all those kind of people. So I actually played blues initially as a guitar player, but into pop music. But what got me into country was actually I hated psychedelic music. That whole summer of '67 stuff, you know, with what Chris Hillman once said, the lyrics were bad high school yearbook poetry. He described the lyrics of the psychedelic music and these meandering guitar solos. And then I heard the Buffalo Springfield doing Go and Say Goodbye, which is very country, and Charles Claim to Fame. And then, you know, after that doing Kind Woman. And they were touching on country in a rock context. And then Time Between, which came out in, would that come out in '66? I think it was, or '67 by the Byrds and Chris Hillman with Clarence White playing guitar on it. And that just connected with me. And it brought me back to when I was a toddler at home, even before I started school. My mom would have the radio on in the kitchen all the time. My father was a railway engineer. And so often we had to, you know, keep quiet the rest of the house because he was sleeping all night. And as he worked nights, and the music that I heard in the radio was largely country music. This is in the early to mid '50s, and it didn't. I mean, back in those days, you didn't categorize music. You might hear a country song by Ernest Tubb, followed by a Frank Sinatra song, followed by an Al Hirt trumpet jazz song, that sort of thing. But the country stuff stuck with me. And when I began to hear country tinges, country tones in the rock context, it really appealed to that in me about the honesty and authenticity and storytelling element of country music that psychedelic music just did not have. It was just so soulless and vapid. So it kind of piqued my interest to kind of get into that. And being a big Buffalo Springfield fan, they kind of led me, they and the Byrds, into, you know, in '68 buying the Dillard and Clark album, you know, Fantastic Expedition of Dillard and Clark, and then the first Poco album in early '69, and connecting with all of it. But I think overriding all of that was I just fell in love with pedal steel guitar. And I just loved pedal. I still do. I'll go see anybody if they got a pedal steel guitar player in the band. I love pedal steel guitar, and I liked hearing it being used in kind of a rock context, like with Poco, the Burrito Brothers, all of that sort of thing. So my trip into country rock began by following some of these rock bands in the mid to later '60s, and then you know, carrying on through all of that. But I certainly credit the Buffalo Springfield and the Byrds with kicking it all off for me. And certainly with the Byrds, it's Chris Hillman.
I would say of all the people in my record collection that occurs more times than anybody else is Chris Hillman. That and David Lindley, who sadly passed away, didn't he, last week?
Yes, yeah.
And you know, I'm a great fan of, I've always been a great fan of Jackson Browne and his wonderful lyrics and everything else as well. And to me, I think again, it was steel guitar that got me into it. I remember there used to be a guy called B.J. Cole who. Yes,
I know. I just wrote about him last week because it was the anniversary of his birth or his death or something. I have a Facebook site called John Einarson Remembers. I do music history every day, and I had a post about B.J. Cole.
Yeah, he was a wonder, and you know, he had this wonderful playing style. And I think I saw him live. I think he was with a band called Cochise.
Yes, I remember
which
that.
They played our school. They played my school, Cochise. And of course, in those days, I couldn't differentiate between standard rock and country rock because I didn't know the subtle difference. And then I remember getting heavily into a band called Starry Eyed and Laughing. Who were a wonderful English band that really failed. And I met that band a few years ago, many years ago now, actually. It was Tony Poole, I think, was the main guy. And I met them after they did a concert. And I mentioned that I bought their first album and their second album. And he turned around to me, and he called the rest of the band over, and he said, "We found the guy. It was him." And I have, and they've just brought out a new album now. They can't call themselves Starry Eyed and Laughing, but they brought out a new album in the last week or two. Tony Poole and his associates. So it'd be very interesting to check that. But it was kind of a style of music that just, as you said, it spoke to you in some way, you know, and it was ordinary people's lives. And although I'd gone through the music, I'd liked Yes, and I liked Genesis and everybody else as well, but I found them ever so slightly pretentious, whereas the roots bands were just talking about real life, you know. And there's that wonderful song, isn't there? Have you heard the one, If You Play a Country Song Backwards? Do you know that one?
Yeah,
You get
your
car
truck
back
starts and you get your wife comes back and your dog doesn't die or something.
And it's wonderful, but it kind of takes the pastiche of it. But I always felt that country rock just, you know, and then they had Brinsley Schwartz, you know, and I think BJ Cole played for Brinsley Schwartz as well. And then, of course, the English bands that came up that were teaching us, the bands that we think are folk bands, people like Fairport Convention. Of course, Ian Matthews, you know, did some of definitive country rock albums.
Yeah, and he covered Gene Clark. He covered a lot of other country rock artists on his albums. I loved him. I thought he was just fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely.
I bought everything, even obscure stuff I could get back, you know, in the 70s and 80s. I bought Ian Matthews.
I know.
And I loved Plainsong.
Yes.
In Search of Amelia Earhart. I
yes.
in love with that album. I wore out one copy. I bought two more. One I still have sealed in case the other one gets worn out.
I must try and get Ian Matthews on this program, actually, because we are in contact. He's living out in the Netherlands now, and he's still touring, and everything else. And maybe I'll message him, see if we can get him on. Maybe you and I could talk to him about it.
Wonderful.
You know, because the early Fairport Convention, everybody says Fairport Convention were, you know, folk rock, but they weren't. They were country rock, you know, and they moved into. And of course, there's this overlap, isn't there, between folk and country anyway, you know. And this,
well, yeah, and a lot of the in my focus in my writing has been largely on the California country rock scene, and a lot of those guys came out of the folk scene and out of, you know, what Bernie Ledden called the folk scare or the folk boom, you know, that began with the Kingston Trio in '58 and carried through until, you know, the Beatles and the British Invasion and all that. You know, the folk boom of that time, and they grew up on that music. And it's interesting to note how many of them cite, for example, the Kingston Trio as being a big influence on them. And even on the second Buffalo Springfield album, on the back, they list, you know, each of the guys kind of lists their you know, the people that influenced them in some way. And right there is the Kingston Trio, who had a big impact on them. Also, Randy Bachman is also listed on there.
Really?
Too.
Really? So Randy Bachman of Bachman Turner Overdrive and You Ain't Seen Nothing Yet was an influence on.
Well, Neil Young used to go follow him everywhere in Winnipeg to go see him play. You know, when Neil Young was nobody, and Bachman was a somebody playing in what was called Chad Allen and the Expressions, and they became the Guess Who. And Neil has always been very open about that. I was on a documentary about Bachman a couple of years ago, filmed for it. So was Neil. And he said Neil Young was he said Randy Bachman was my biggest influence back then.
Really? How interesting.
And who influenced Randy and Neil was Hank Marvin from the Shadows. They loved him. And excuse me, about 15 years ago, the Shadows were doing, maybe 10 years ago or somewhere, they were doing some kind of a reunion show and they weren't going to be playing together anymore, some kind of a tour. And Randy and Neil got tickets to go see them at the Hammersmith Odeon, which I think is called the Apollo now. And they went to go meet the Shadows backstage, and they were just like teenage girls meeting Justin Bieber. They were so excited. And Hank gave his salmon-colored Fender Stratocaster, you know, the story goes it's the first Fender Stratocaster ever in the UK, to handed it to Randy and said, here, do you want to play this? And Randy was like, you know, what am I going to play?
This is what I love about your writing and your books is you have so many anecdotes and stories. You seem to really know, and because you know many of the characters personally, you have this wonderful position. Because we were talking beforehand and you mentioned we were talking about Paul McCartney, and you told me a wonderful story about Paul. I know we're going off tangent, but you know, I've found a fellow enthusiast, so you know, just mention this.
Well, what stimulated that was your anecdote about Paul McCartney not knowing who you were. And so, Paul McCartney knows who I am, but not for the right reasons. He came to perform. He's just billed as Paul McCartney now. He came to perform in Winnipeg about 5 years ago in a big outdoor show, you know, 50,000 people. And the local newspaper always gets me to, if it's some music history related thing, they get me to write, you know, a little bit of background on it. So I did. But in the article, I referred to Paul McCartney as a nostalgia act. I said, there's nobody going to that show tonight or tomorrow who was waiting to hear anything new from Paul McCartney. They want to hear the old stuff, some of the stuff going back, to the Beatles and 50 years ago. And the promoter was a friend of mine, and I didn't go to the show, but actually I was flying. I was flying to Liverpool that day to lead a tour. I used to do these tours. Anyway, so he told me afterwards, he said, when he arrived, Paul McCartney had the newspaper open to my article, and he was pointing at my name saying, "Who is this guy? You shouldn't be saying that. I'm not a nostalgia." He was pissed off at me.
Well, just quickly, so it gives me the opportunity just to tell my story of Paul McCartney doesn't know me. And what happened was, many years ago, I was working as a management consultant, and I was working for the Thomson organization in London, which is a Canadian company originally. Yeah. I was quite surprised when I first went to Toronto, and I went up the tower there, and the Thomson organization sponsored the bit at the top, which I thought was quite weird. But anyway,
well, one of the big venues in Toronto was Thompson Hall, Roy Thompson Hall.
All right.
Big concert venue. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's all right. And Thompson without a P. We were always told you don't put the P in Thompson. There's no P in Thompson. I'm sure there's a joke there somewhere, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But anyway, what happened was that I was doing some work with a lady called Tricia McIntosh. We got talking one day, and I mentioned that I was originally from the Merseyside area. And I said, and funnily enough, I went to school with a guy called Ted Robbins, and I was in the Drama Society at school with Ted Robbins, who became a vaguely famous British comedian. He was on a lot of TV programs many years ago, and his two sisters still are. But it was interesting because she then turned around and she said, "Oh, this is interesting," because she said, "My brother, Danny McIntosh, plays in Wings. He plays as a session musician in Wings, or plays as a musician in Wings." And she said the interesting thing is that whenever Wings play in London, Paul and Linda and the band come round and they have a big fry up at my mum's council flat in North London. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And I didn't think anything else of it. Anyway, she rings me back about a month later, and she said, "Oh, Paul and Linda and the band were round at my mum's house last night, and we got talking about people we knew." And she said, "I mentioned I knew you, and that you had gone to school with Ted Robbins, Paul's cousin." And apparently, Paul McCartney sat there and went, Tony Peake, I don't think I know him." So for a moment, I was in the mind of a legend, for a split second, I flitted through his neurons, and I probably got lost in his synaptic gap, But yeah, I'm the synaptic gap in Paul McCartney's world. Probably could describe
I'm a thorn in his side, is what I am.
So we've got something absolutely, I'm his synaptic gap and you're his thorn. I'm sure we could actually build on this in many, many ways. But going back again, moving on, quickly, because we're going to go on for hours here, but one of the things that I noticed in the background, that you have the CSN album, which I've actually got as well, because it's for completion's sake, because it has a lot of out tracks and things from other albums. And before we started, we got talking about the great David Crosby. And of course, we lost David Crosby recently. But apparently that you have a copy of that's signed, you tell me?
I do. When I was doing my Gene Clark book, Gene Clark, for those who don't know, was the tambourine player and really the principal songwriter in the early Byrds. And of course, I wanted to talk with Hillman and McGuinn and Crosby, who were the three, still alive from those days. And for Crosby, he said, when I emailed him, he said, "Well, I'm going to be playing in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in this particular date. Why don't you come down? I'll leave a backstage pass there at the door, and come in and we'll do an interview there." So when the date came, I went down there to do an interview with him, and sat in each of the three guys had separate dressing rooms and separate tour buses.
Wow!
So they only mingled on stage. Otherwise, they kind of went their own way. So I met up with Crosby and spent almost 2 hours with him in his separate dressing room. And, it's funny. McGuinn said this when I told this story I'm going to tell you. McGuinn said, death makes people reflective. And what happened was, I was there to talk to Crosby about Gene Clark. And it's fairly well documented that Crosby was a real jerk to Gene Clark. I mean, Crosby was, private school kid, and privileged. His dad was an Academy Award-winning cinematographer. And Gene Clark, finished high school, and that was it. Came from a family of 13 kids. They lived in a 2-bedroom house in the middle of a park. So David picked on Gene Clark, and thought he was a hick, just a dummy. And David managed, like, initially the rhythm guitar role was Gene Clark's, but Crosby managed to convince Gene that Crosby was a better guitar player than Gene. So he talked Gene out of that role. Gene became the tambourine player. But he humiliated Gene a lot and talked down to him a lot. And in bringing that up to Crosby, as we sat and interviewed, he got all teary-eyed. He got, wiping tears away. And he admitted, he said, I don't know if I can use this phrase on your show, but he said, I was a real asshole to Gene Clark, and I feel bad about it. Again, it's the idea of when someone passes, you become reflective. But that's one of my claims to fame. I made David Crosby cry. I also made John Kay of Steppenwolf cry too, but that's another story.
Wow!
Because I did a book with John Kay. So when we were leaving,
well, that's totally Born to Be Wild, isn't it?
Yeah. When we were leaving the dressing room, just before we did, I don't usually get the people I interview to sign an autograph. I've seen how that changes the dynamic of a relationship. If I show up to sit down and talk to David Crosby with an armful of Byrds albums and CSN albums, all of a sudden I'm a fan. I'm not the interviewer anymore. And it changes the professional relationship and the way they would deal with me. So I don't do that. And but I figured I'm not going to see David Crosby. This is a big deal. And his first biography, A Long Time Gone, was such a big influence on me that I brought the book and I brought the poster. I thought, wow, what the hell? And he signed the book, which thrilled about. And he signed the poster. And we came out of the dressing room and Graham Nash was there. And so I said to Nash, would you mind sign this? And Crosby said who I was. And he signed it. But Stephen Stills wasn't around. So I figured, okay, 2 out of 3. I'll live with 2 out of 3. And then 3 months later, Crosby, Stills, and Nash came to play in my hometown of Winnipeg. And Crosby sent a note with, come by, backstage pass and tickets, and come see me afterwards. And so we went afterwards backstage, and Stills had already gone on his bus and he was about to leave. And I had the poster, and Crosby said to a roadie, called him over and said, here, get Stephen to sign this fellow, before he leaves. And so the roadie went, and he came back a couple of minutes later and said, Stephen says he's not signing anything. So Crosby looked at the roadie and says, you tell Stephen Stills that this is for a personal friend of mine. And off he goes, and he comes back and it's signed. And, I didn't want to take the chance that maybe a roadie signed it. When I got home, I went online looking for Stephen Stills' signature, and it was authentic. It was the real thing. So then I got it mounted and framed along with a few other things in my little office here.
So if you could have get a hold of Neil Young then as well, you'd have got the full set, wouldn't you, I suppose?
I've got lots of stuff signed by Neil Young. I mean, I've sat in his living room with him, interviewing him. And whenever Neil Young comes to Winnipeg, and I don't know if he's going to be coming again, but whenever he comes to Winnipeg, he always sends me, my wife and I, tickets, the best seats in the house, and backstage passes. Wow. And so we hang out with him. We've hung out with him on his tour bus, backstage with him at concerts, chatting. And a few years ago, being a guitar player, I bought a White Falcon. It's a Gretsch White Falcon, which is the big white guitar that Neil plays often, and Stills also plays a White Falcon as well. Yeah. It's a top of the line Gretsch model, and it's $5,000, and I bought one. But the last time Neil was here, which was 2 years ago, I took the pick guard off and I took it backstage with him, and I got him to sign it. So I have a White Falcon signed by Neil Young. I would have loved to have him sign the guitar, but I didn't want to bring it to the show, so I signed it.
Well, because it's funny, isn't it, with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, when you hear the onstage banter, particularly, the wonderful onstage banter on Four-Way Street, don't pay Mumbledy-Peg with you, he'll steal your leg, kind of thing. And I just love that. And the bit where they're about to harmonize, and they both, Crosby and Nash start on the same note. They said, I couldn't believe those guys could do that. So you think that they have this wonderful dynamic, but clearly that's not
Well,
the case, you know, that
yeah, well, by this point, and this was in God the 1990s. By this point, there was a lot of water under the bridge, and off and on kind of stuff. Yeah, I've interviewed Neil a few times. I sat in his living room interviewing for a biography I did on him called Neil Young, Don't Be Denied, the Canadian Years. Because no one's ever really talked about the 5 years or so that he got started his career and formed his first bands in Winnipeg and made his first recordings in Winnipeg. First songs he wrote were here in Winnipeg.
before
And
he headed down in the
yeah,
hearse.
yeah.
Yeah.
A song like Don't Be Denied, we moved to Winnipeg, I checked into school, formed a band and all that sort of thing. And when I called him to ask him if he would give me some time, I figured on the phone to talk about the Winnipeg years, I said, how come no one's ever written about that before? And he said, well, no one's ever asked me. So that kind of set us up, and he invited me down on his dime, believe it or not. And I was supposed to stay on the ranch at the guest house, Broken Arrow Ranch. But at the last minute, he'd flown Linda Ronstadt and Nicolette Larson in to do.
Oh, beautiful
he,
Nicolette Larson. Wow.
he was recording Harvest Moon, and he brought them in to do some singing. Last minute, I guess they were both available. So he put them in the guest house and put me in a beautiful suite at a hotel in San Mateo. But, I said to him afterwards, I said, hey, I would have bunked in with Linda and Nicolette.
Of course, what a difficult thing that would have been. Wasn't there somebody once said that there are two types of men? There are men who fancy Linda Ronstadt and people who are not interested in life or something. It was a very, very clever, because I recently saw a documentary on her, and she was just so cute. But then again, so was Nicolette Larson, wasn't she? I mean, yes. What a lucky guy. I mean, wow. What?
Dear. The last time Neil was here in Winnipeg, as I started off saying, and we were backstage, I took him aside and I said to him, because I wasn't sure he was going to be traveling anymore or touring. And he had his new wife with him, and he introduced me to his new wife, Daryl Hannah. And I took him aside and I said, I want to thank you for all the wonderful things you've done for me. The tickets, the backstage passes, and being a friend. And he just looked at me and smiled and said, we take care of our friends. And that meant so much to me. And I don't pester him. I mean, he's contacted me when he was putting the Archives first box set together, and he sent me a lovely gift for doing that. And when he was writing his first autobiography, Raising Heavy Peace, I think it's called, Waging Heavy Peace, he contacted me for information, that sort of thing. And I'm happy to do that. But I get people, I swear to God, it's like 3 times a month, someone say, oh, we're having a fundraiser, we're having a garage sale, we'd like Neil to come by. He's not going to do that.
That is the difficulty, isn't it? With the people and as you say, and it's very interesting, isn't it, gauging the relationship. And you're not a fan, you are a chronicler of their lives and what they do. And there are a number of things that there's so many questions I'm interested in asking you about those kind of relationships. I mean, for instance, I've never understood why the Neil Young movie Rust Never Sleeps, and he has all those little creatures like from Star coming on the stage and bleeping away, which is
the road eyes.
Is that what they call
the road eyes? The road eyes.
Right. So
because you just see their eyes with them.
Yeah. Because if anybody's watching here, really check out that Rust Never Sleeps, because the music is so raw, isn't it? And his guitar playing is so incredibly powerful in that, it's extraordinary. But moving back to David Crosby, one of the things that I was so sad, because I always wanted to meet David Crosby just to ask him about the background to his song Deja Vu, as to why he wrote that. Have you any idea about?
No, it's not something within the kind of the purview of the parameters of what I was interviewing him for. I would love to know that too, because it's one of my favorite songs. And I love that I remember buying the album probably mid to late 1970. And that's the first track. And we put the needle on. Yeah. You remember that, folks, needles and vinyl. Put the needle on, and you hear the little voices setting the rhythm up for it. And then it starts with this really fast kind of jazzy thing. And then it breaks completely into a slower tempo song. I thought it was brilliant, and still to this day, it's my favorite track on that album. Yes, I'm a Neil Young fan, and obviously, Helpless is on that album, but the song Deja Vu was brilliant. I would love, if well, you can't now, he's gone. I would love to
Yeah,
know
which is
too.
sad.
Who's
I
behind
would
that
love to know.
album.
And it's also Wooden Ships has also always intrigued me as a song, as to what, I've been eating these purple berries. I've been eating them for 6 or 7 weeks, Mark, and I haven't got sick once. And just the interplay between the two voices when the two characters are talking, is really good. And the sad thing, when I was at university, I recorded I recorded a cassette tape version of that, and clearly one of the tracks wasn't recording very well, so I only ever got one side of that conversation. So I never knew what the other guy said when he said, I've been eating these berries for 6 or 7 weeks now. So I have no idea. I do know now, but I didn't at the time, so it was a great...
Well, it's post-apocalyptic, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Good.
And that creepy line, silver people on the shoreline, and you think, whoa, this is an extraordinarily clever song. But again, just lyrically, Crosby is, because of course I mentioned to you in a message that my ringtone on my phone is We Have All Been Here Before on a loop, because I think that works so well, the idea we've been here before, and it repeats over and over again. And I loved that album, Deja Vu. I just thought it was just incredible. It worked on so many ways. And one of the things that always intrigued me was the similarities between Country Girl, and how the Country Girl song and a Buffalo Springfield song, I can't remember which one it is now, but it's a very similar...
Broken Arrow.
Broken Arrow, yes, Broken Arrow.
Yeah.
Which was on
a pastiche of a lot of different themes that actually Neil he and Jimmy Messina kind of pieced that together, Broken Arrow. And in fact, there's a couple of tunes within the Country Girls suite that were Buffalo Springfield songs.
Like so
Whiskey Boot Hill being in there, and Down, 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 some of the lyrics from that he stuck into the Country Girls suite. And I remember reading Stephen Stills being pissed off with that song because he said, "Oh, it's just Neil trying to get more credits by saying it's A, B, and C parts to it."
Yeah, because I had that Broken Arrow song on a sampler album called Ages of Atlantic, which came out in the UK, and I didn't know who Buffalo Springfield at the time was. And in fact, I was introduced to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young album by a girlfriend of mine whose elder sister had the album, and it was when that was playing and Country Girl came on, and I thought, that's like that track by Buffalo Springfield. And clearly, very, very clever way of pulling things together there as well, which I think Neil Young. And of course, we've mentioned Crosby, Stills, Nash. We haven't mentioned Nash yet, and we haven't mentioned Stephen Stills, but I would say that probably an album I go back to time and time again because I love it so much is Manassas.
Yeah, the first one, right?
The first one, the double album.
Yeah, the double album, because the second
down
one,
the road didn't work for me in quite the same.
It didn't work for anybody. It was a commercial failure. And it's interesting, when I interviewed Al Perkins, the pedal steel player in Manassas, he said we recorded that album, down the road twice. And the first version, we sent the tracks to Atlantic Records, whoever, and they said, "This is rubbish. I mean, we're not going to put this up. Go back and record something else." So they recorded almost an entirely new album, and that became Down the Road, and it was still rubbishy. When you consider how incredible that first Manassas album was, and it was, I've always said Stephen Stills' peak period is 66, first Buffalo Springfield album, it really is first recordings, and the first Manassas album, which is like 72. Everything he did during that time, the 2 solo albums he did, the Crosby, Stills and Nash first, and with Young on the second album, and the 3 Buffalo Springfield albums, he's consistent. After that, it's spotty. And listening to some of his solo albums, and also the Crosby, Stills and Nash albums, like the one with the wieners on a stick on the moon, that sort of thing. He's got
American Dream. I can't stand that album.
Well, Neil told me that the only reason he did that album was he promised Crosby, when Crosby went in jail, that if he cleaned himself up, he would do an album with Crosby, Stills and Nash and Young. So when Crosby came out and he was clean, he had to follow through on his promise, and he did the album. But yeah, it's a terrible album. And one of the things I liked about that box set that we've been talking about, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, is it brings out the best stuff that Stills did over that later period of time, without having to listen to some of the lousy tunes that he did during that time too. So it highlights the strengths of Stephen Stills in that later period. But I think he was just unstoppable from 66 to 72.
Totally. I mean, for instance, you mentioned, is it Al Bloomfield or
Al Perkins?
Yeah, no, where Stephen Stills did that Super Session album with Bloomfield and
Al Cooper. Yeah.
Al Cooper, you know, and I mean, that was very interesting in its own way, and you could see the kind of Stephen Stills guitar style. But for me, again, we were discussing earlier on, to me, one of the most incredible extended tracks that I know, where it breaks in the middle and it changes, is the Treasure Take One.
Yeah.
And wow, you know, guys, if you want to listen to a song that it takes you along with it and then suddenly changes in the middle to a completely different song, because of course in that 4 sides, each of the sides, you know, had the Latin beats that Stephen Stills always liked, you know, the Mexican sound, and then that wonderful side that was very country rock, you know, and that Colorado song, and everything about that album is perfect. And do you think it's a double album and there's not one duff track on it?
Yep,
not
that's
one.
right. And then you wonder, well, how is it that the second album, how did he kind of lose the page from the first album to the second? And you know, there's been some, I've seen something recorded in the Netherlands. It's Manassas Live, you know, after the first album. They're playing the songs off the album, and it's absolutely brilliant. You know, Byron Berline had told me that he was invited to join Manassas because when that first album was being recorded in Miami, Criterion Studios, the Flying Burrito Brothers were really doing what would become their last tour, and the album Last of the Red Hot Burritos was being recorded during that time. And Stills on weekdays, because they would play weekends at Burritos on the East Coast of the United States, and on the weekdays they weren't playing, he would fly Hillman and Perkins and Byron Berline and Rick Roberts down there to help with the Manassas album. And he even at one point said to the guys from the Burritos, look, have you got some gigs coming up? They said, yeah, you know, here, there are a couple of colleges, whatever. He said, I'll pay you guys what you would have made on those gigs to stay here and cancel the gigs. That's how much he really wanted that bluegrass feel to that, what became that side of the 4 sides of that album. But Byron Berline said he just couldn't do it because he said there was so much cocaine surrounding the recording of that album. He said, and sometimes the guys were just kind of nuts from just doing too much drugs. And they gave Stills, of course, the run of the studio, so he could record 24 hours a day, you know, 7 days a week. So he, you know, up and vibrating from all the coke. And Byron said, I just couldn't be around that. And Al Perkins confirmed that, because Al Perkins is he's straight as an arrow.
Yeah,
he's very religious. He's a Christian,
because he converted Richie Fury, didn't he?
Yeah. And I said to him, how in the world could you be around all of that? And he said, I just ignored it. He said, you know, I didn't take part in it. I knew I was there for the music. I wasn't there for the recreation for it at all. But I just think that the drugs eventually took their toll on Stephen Stills after that.
That's very sad, isn't it? You know, and a name you mentioned there, Rick Roberts. I mean, a band that I've got everything they've ever done is Firefall. You know, and I thought, what a great band they were. You know, and the music they did. They have this kind of wonderful, almost, well, they call it yacht rock, don't they? Is the idea?
Yeah. But in California, yacht rock.
and I think they were ultimate. And another band I really liked that period were Orleans as well. You know, John Hall and the music they were doing. Yeah. So we've discussed then Stephen Stills and everything else as well. Oh, by the way, as a question, as an expert on this sort, it's a question I've always wanted to ask: was the band called Manassas? Or was it just because the station they're standing on was Manassas Junction, and therefore we associate the band name with Manassas? I mean, would Stephen Stills say that band was called Manassas?
Yes. Stephen Stills had, I guess maybe he still does, he had a real interest in Civil War history. You know, out of that comes Find the Cost of Freedom Buried in the Ground. He's writing about the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so Manassas, the Battle of Manassas is more commonly known as the Battle of Bull Run. You may have heard of the Battle of Bull Run.
Yes.
And Stephen had a fascination with that. And so the band was named before they took the picture at the train station.
Right. Good. That's a wonderful piece of information. That's one of those kind of bits of information I've always wanted to know from somebody who actually knows. And then we move on. So we've done the great Stephen Stills, and then we move on to Graham Nash. you know, and Graham's contribution, I think, has always been understated because, again, one of my favorite albums is his album Wild Tales. You know, that I think he was massively underrated. He was just the harmony with David Crosby, because, you know, the famous story where they harmonized in whoever's house it was, Joni Mitchell's, whoever. And you feel, no, he wrote some extraordinary stuff. And again, I think of all my Crosby, Stills and Nash variation albums, I think the Crosby Nash album, where they did Immigration Man.
Yes.
It's a wonderful album, you know, extraordinarily good. And it shows the richness of this kind of musical genre, doesn't it? It really does. I
mean, Nash, he's known for his harmony singing. He's less known for his songwriting. And that's sad, because he is regarded as the lightweight of the three, even though he's more prolific than Crosby was. You know, you look at the albums and there's more stuff by Nash than Crosby. And that's not to say that Crosby didn't write, but Nash was more prolific. It's just that Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, Guinevere, you know, Pre-Road Downs, you know, which I always thought was kind of the weakest album and weakest song on the album. And then the song that I just loathe, Powerhouse.
I must admit,
I mean, it's so sweet. I get cavities and pimples listening to it. And it kind of gave him the tag as the lightweight poppy kind of guy. And you know, Marrakesh Express too, which was originally written for the Hollies and they wouldn't do it. So it's got that pop feel when you compare it to Sweet Judy Blue Eyes and Guinevere and Long Time Gone and Wooden Ships. And then here comes Marrakesh Express.
Again, all those songs, they shivers up the spine, you know, and the Helplessly Hoping, the alliteration, the wonderful alliteration of that song. It's sheer poetry, isn't it? You know,
it's wonderful. And
Helplessly Hoping is Harlequin hovers nearby, awaiting a word. I mean, that is Shakespeare, you know, to me.
That Stills, I think, again at his best, is that from that period of time, coming out of that and writing all that stuff really in the period between the folding of Buffalo Springfield in early '68 until, you know, they start recording in early '69 for the Crosby, Stills and Nash album. Stills was writing all this stuff and even making demos. I've heard some demos with him and Crosby, just the two of them, before Nash was even in the picture, doing this music. I mean, he was just so inspired and so creative. And you know, I've interviewed people, because from the Buffalo Springfield book, I interviewed people like Narit Wild, who knew Stills in the early days, and they said, out of all the guys in the Buffalo Springfield, he was the one hungriest for acclaim. Not so much the money, but hungriest for stardom and acclaim. And he was very heartbroken when he didn't make the Monkees.
Yes, I know. It's a little known story, that, isn't it?
And he's always given interviews saying, well, you know, I didn't want to do, you know, they didn't want to do my songs, but so I'm fine with that. No, Narit, who was friends with Torque and friends with Stills and others, she says he was heartbroken, and he carried that with him for a long time, that he didn't get into the Monkees. But she said, don't let him, you know, tell you that it's all about the fact that he was a songwriter and they already had songs. It was because he had bad teeth and his hair was already receding. And they didn't want to have to pay to fix his teeth and to deal with his hair. I mean, maybe he could have been the monkey wearing the toque all the time, but it was those two things that because the Monkees were created not as a real band at the time. They were guys who were going to look good on TV and had teen appeal. And he didn't have that, but his buddy Peter Tork did.
But that's going to be an interesting sort of alternate history, a kind of Philip K. Dickian alternate history idea. That imagine the scenario that he'd have joined the Monkees and him and Michael Nesmith would have worked together, because of course Nesmith, you know, with his work in country rock as well, that could have been a very interesting dynamic, the two of them working together, you know, quite intriguing, really, an alternate history scenario.
I did something like that online about 6 months ago. I did an alternate history whereby, what if David Crosby hadn't been kicked out of the Byrds?
Yeah.
Well, we wouldn't have had Crosby, Stills and Nash. We wouldn't have had Graham Parsons, because Graham Parsons was brought in to replace Crosby.
Crosby, yeah.
And you know, and then all the ripple effect that comes out of, if Graham Parsons, you know, never joined the Byrds, it wouldn't have been the Burrito Brothers, and no one would have found Emmylou Harris.
Yeah.
And really, and on and on and on. All, you know, the huge impact. And I also did one too about a couple of years ago. What would happen if on April the 6th, 1966, when Neil and Bruce Palmer are in their hearse going one way on Sunset Boulevard, and Stills and Richie Furay and Barry Friedman went the other way. And if they had looked, if I mean, I interviewed all of the people from that, and they all gave a slightly different version of it. But what if they hadn't seen the hearse?
Yeah.
Then we wouldn't have had Buffalo Springfield. And then you think about what came out of Buffalo Springfield we might not have had. You know, okay, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Pope,
but even Logan's and Messina, you know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, all of that.
You know, I do find that, because in my own writing, I play with a lot of these kind of ideas of history and time and how time plays with it. And one of my favorite stories, and you're going to love this one. It was my 20th birthday, and it was April the 12th, 1974. Okay. And I go down, I was at university, and I go down to buy the newspapers, and there's the Daily Mirror, and it's there. And the headline on the Daily Mirror said, April the 12th, 1954, the day that rocked the world. And I'm looking around thinking my friends have spoofed this up somehow. And I'm looking at this, I'm going, what the hell? And apparently it was the day that Rock Around the Clock was recorded. So I'm literally to the day, the child of rock and roll, which always kind of amused me, that. And of course the other April the 12th 1861, when the American Civil War started, Fort Sumter and everything. Because I don't know if you remember, there was a cards that came out in the mid 1960s called the American Civil War cards.
Yes, I as a kid, I mean, I had them probably
Mars Attacks 50s. And then them.
Yeah, and you know, you collected them all.
And they smell that smell of the gum.
The gum.
I can still smell that smell of the gum on the cards. And I collected all of those, and I became really fascinated by the American Civil War, because they were so gory, weren't they?
Yeah, you know? Well, I mean, I remember the one of the wheel running over a guy's arm.
Oh, the worst one was called Painful Death, where a guy had been thrown.
Was that the spikes?
Spikes, when he was on the spikes.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know what we need to do is to work together on writing a book on nostalgia for people of our generation going up at that time, because these things were so powerful. Like, you know, the Mars Attacks, when they did that movie version of Mars Attacks, you know, but we grew up with the cards themselves before they banned them, you know. Yeah. The card everybody wanted then was what was it? It was where a guy had been burned. The aliens, the Martians had burned him alive or something. I can't remember what it was now. But everybody wanted that card, you know.
We see in Canada, we all collected hockey cards.
Oh yes, of course.
Yeah, that was a big deal. And baseball cards. I remember having so many baseball cards, and then you grow out of it, and you know, they're sitting around in a box, and a few years later, mom's cleaning up the basement. You've already moved out.
She throws them away.
Them all out. Yeah, I had Rolling Stone magazines from the start, from the first issue on, and you know, I moved away from home and whatever. My mom's cleaning up, and you know, all the stuff gets chucked.
Happened to me. I had a load of melody makers that somebody had given me from the late 1960s onwards. All the reviews of Led Zeppelin albums and everything else. And again, my mother threw them all away. And she said, well, they were just magazines. And Mum, they were not magazines. So I never allowed that to happen to me now. So I've got a full collection downstairs till I stopped collecting it of Q magazine. You know, the Q magazine.
I have a big stack. There's a cupboard right over here. And in it is a big stack of Q and a big stack of Mojo and a big stack of like Trouser Press. I bought Trouser Press and Gorilla Beat in these magazines in the 70s, all in there. And my wife, again, she's saying, you know, when you die, I don't want to deal with this, and your kids and grandkids don't want to deal with this.
I know, it's tragedy, isn't it?
2,000 vinyl albums in there, and she's saying, hey, the kids don't want this stuff, and they don't want to have to deal with it. Sell it now, and you can see, you know, that that particular album, you know, Nashville Teens, Tobacco Road, still sealed, 1964. Wow. you can go to a home where someone really wants it, rather than just.
Because I find that with some of the albums I've got, and the one that is my pride of place, and it's virtually, I don't know how many copies are available of this. It's an album called The Hoax's Midnight Daydream.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Oh, and what happened was, and a friend of mine his father owned a record shop, and what happened was they were deciding whether they were going to bring out a Cat Stevens live album or a Cat Stevens greatest hits, and they sent out white label albums to various selected outlets to ask the people what they liked, and they went out with the greatest hits album. But I managed to get hold. My friend gave me a white copy of The Hoax's Midnight Daydream. So there's a live version there of things like The Boy with the Moon and Stars on his head, and various other things as well. And that I would, if I'd lost that, I think I'd be so upset, because I've no idea of the value of that. But I'd never ever sell it, because it's just a unique piece. But when we die, our wives and our children will just think, what the hell was this? Like our mothers, and throw them away.
Yeah. They don't know they don't recognize or know the value, nor do they want to bother finding out the value, because it's just dad's old crap, and they'll just take it away somewhere. It's like my guitars. I got 5 really expensive rare guitars, 2 Gretschers, and a 50-year-old Les Paul, and wow. I might as well sell them while I can, enjoy seeing someone who wants them get them, because
that's a good point.
I always figured, I have 5 grandkids. I always figured, if I got 5 guitars, 5 grandkids, I'll leave the guitars to them and they can pick one they want. And then my son told me, he said, well, that's kind of not fair, because you've got this Les Paul that's worth, thousands and thousands of dollars. You've got a couple of Gretschers, but you've got a Taylor acoustic, which is probably worth only $2,000. So who's going to get stuck with that? Well, probably the youngest grandchild will get that one, where the oldest grandchild will take the Les Paul right away. And then what are they going to do with them?
Well, they could form a band and be the Canadian Osmonds,
Yeah, there we go.
Or again, somebody else that I really wanted to talk about as well, which we'll probably talk about longer, is one of my associates, one of my friends, one of my readers in America, is a really good friend of Pete Rowan.
Okay.
Of the Rowans.
And C-Train, love C-Train.
Yeah, I only got into C-Train because I was supposed to be interviewing Pete Rowan on this program, which we're going to try and plan to do later this year. And I was going into his back catalogue because I really loved the Rowans band, their first album. I really loved that one. And then I recently acquired one of the other ones he did, and I got into his music. And he's so interesting, he's so many
fascinating, eclectic kind of a career.
Oh, wow. And he's a practicing Buddhist, so he writes songs about Buddhism. And
I didn't know that.
Very, very interesting man. But apparently he's very difficult to nail down because he's very mercurial. So it's trying to get him on the show, or trying to get in advance, because he'll go off and do something else, which I quite understand. Why do you want to be interviewed by Anthony Peake when you can go off and do a concert down somewhere else? Right. Well, we've run out of time. That was extraordinary. All I can say,
it was a lot of fun. It was absolutely fun.
Wonderful fun. And I think we've just scratched the surface on. I hope everybody listening here has not gone, oh God, those 2 bloody old guys wibbiting on about bloody music that nobody cares about. I don't care. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it makes you go out.
I had a blast. I mean, we could go on all the rest of the day here.
Well, we're going to. What we'll do is we'll get the 2-hour show, and we'll just go with the flow. Go with ideas, go with the flow, go with music that we like. There's so many bands I haven't even touched upon I wanted to talk to you about. But everybody go out and check John's books. They are extraordinary, and he covers so many bands in so many areas. Sort of Graham Parsons, the Flying Burrito Brothers, and you get the background to where these guys started up and how they interfaced with each other. And it really helps you build, that years ago, that Rock Family Trees thing. You've done it.
And I did one. For the Desperados book, was supposed to have one in there, so I did it.
Oh, really?
And it's all, and it's just so complex, because the Dillards are in there, and the Scottsville Squirrel Barkers and everything. And the publisher said, this is way too complex and complicated to put in the book. I'll send it to you, okay?
Yeah, please, because what it'll do is I'll be ticking off, because after reading your books, as I say, I've been following some of the bands back, like, what was the band that was pre the Eagles? Shiloh.
Shiloh.
Yeah. And I thought, wow, this is extraordinary. I didn't even know this album existed.
Yeah,
And I managed
yeah,
to
that and Long Branch Penny Whistle. You listen to
Long
Long
Branch
Branch
Penny
Penny
Whistle. You
Whistle,
introduced me
and
to that as well.
you're hearing the Eagles. You're hearing
Yeah.
the early Eagles. Long Branch Penny Whistle.
Yeah, Long Branch Penny Whistle were extraordinary, you know, and you could just see, but it was just too early. And I sometimes feel there's an awful lot of these bands were just too early. I mean, the Canadian, like for instance, with the startup again of the country rock movement. I mean, there was a Canadian band, in the late 1980s, mid to late 1980s in Toronto, Blue Rodeo.
Yes, Blue Rodeo.
And Blue Rodeo, and they were brilliant, but they were just too early.
Yes, yeah. Well, and also Prairie Oyster came around that same time too, and they were a country rock band from Toronto. Great music. But yeah, the timing, it's always all about timing.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like I'm involved in a documentary about the song Born to Be Wild. And, you know, it's a co-production between a Canadian company and a German company. And the timing was perfect for that because 1968 was a very violent year. So people didn't want peace and love and wear flowers in your hair stuff from a year before. Born to Be Wild could only work in 68. It could never have worked in 67.
But would have had the impact if it had not been the seminal tune of Easy Rider as well, you know.
But it had already been a hit by then.
I don't know.
Yeah, it was a hit in summer of 68. Easy Rider is 69.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Yeah, and as you say, John Kay, I always found him terrifying. He always looked so frightening.
Well, you know he's legally blind. That's why he wears the shades.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
He can't see more than about 3 feet in front of him. And he's colorblind. He said all his acid trips were in black and white.
Now that's bad luck, isn't it? That really that begs some certain questions again about the stuff I write about in terms of perception. So that's interesting. So his acid trips were in black and white. Intriguing. Right, John. Well, I'm aware of the fact that we've gone slightly over, but I really enjoyed this. I'll contact you in the next couple of days and we'll get that date in. We normally go out on Mondays, if that's okay, Monday afternoon UK time, so about the same time.
Yeah, that's fine.
We've scratched the surface and I think we could go on for hours, and I think there will be certain people that will love what we're talking about and the rest of them will just think, they'll turn around and say, oh, nerds or something. I don't know.
They'll say, okay, boomer.
Yeah, boomer. Yeah, that's exactly the term they'll use. Okay, John, thank you very much. That was absolutely extraordinary. Thank you very much. And everybody else, thank you. And everybody else, thank you for listening. And I hope you enjoyed that. And take care, everybody. Thank you very much.